Welcome back, everyone. It's time for another read aloud by Mr. Alviar. Reading again, I'll let you know it's one of my favorite books, Cabin on Trouble Creek by Jean Van Leeuwen. We're on chapter 3 tonight. We left off yesterday with Pa, Dan, and Will just starting to make a clearing. Actually, they had made a lean-to sleep in for the night, and there was a little bit of noise that was keeping Dan up, and but he eventually fell asleep there with Pa on one side and his little brother Will on the other. And here we are, chapter 3, the next day. It took days to make a small clearing. Long, hard days, with the sound of Pa's axe ringing out in the quiet forest from first light to near dark. Daniel and Will worked alongside him, lifting and carrying and pushing and rolling. When they got back to the lean-to, they were both so tired they fell asleep almost before finishing their supper of rabbit or squirrel. In Daniel's dreams now, all he saw was the flash of the axe head slicing into the raw wood, over and over and over again. And all he heard was the crash of falling trees. A few of the trees that Pa couldn't cut down outright, those were the granddaddy trees, the ones that looked like they'd been there since the start of creation. He cut deep gashes all around their enormous gnarled trunks. Girdling, he called it. The cuts deadened the tree, not letting the sap rise up to the leaves. The leaves would turn yellow, and in a few months those great trees would wither and die. Little by little, Pa's axe did its work. The gloom of the woods slowly began to lift. One day, glancing up at the treetops, Daniel made out a tiny, shifting patch of blue sky. "Pa!" he said. "Look there!" Pa barely paused, swinging his axe. "Yep," he grunted. "Could be we've made some headway." The straightest trees Pa cut into lengths for the cabin walls. Daniel and Will hitched up old Ben to drag them to the spot where the cabin would stand. The longer logs would become the front and back walls, and the shorter ones the two ends. Day by day, the piles grew higher. Looking at them, Daniel thought they surely had enough logs now to build a cabin. But Pa shook his head. "We'll need about 80 logs in all," he said. He moved away from the clearing, searching the woods for likely trees. Will wandered with him. His voice rang out from all over. "Here's a good one, Pa! Hey, Pa, look over there!" Finally, Pa was satisfied that he'd had enough. Picking 2 of the stoutest timbers, he laid them out on the ground where the cabin was to stand. With his axe, he cut notches in each end. And then, from the pile of shorter logs, he selected 2 more and notched them just the same. And with Daniel and Will's help, he laid these logs across the first 2, matching notch to notch. They fit together neat as could be. Pa stood back and eyed them to make sure the corners were square. "There," he said. "We've got the start of a cabin." Pa cut notches in 4 more logs. With Daniel and Will on one end and Pa on the other, they lifted them onto the place on top of the first ones. The logs were not even, and Daniel could see daylight between them. But he knew they'd be chinking those cracks later and daubing them with clay to keep out the rain and snow. By the end of the afternoon, they had cabin walls 4 logs high. But it got harder after that. Lifting the heavy logs made Daniel's back ache. And though Will never would complain, his face grew red, and Daniel saw his thin arms shaking with strain. Pa gave them a few minutes' rest. I could wish we had neighbors to help out, Daniel admired. We're a little short-handed, Pa said. Nothing could be done about that, so Pa devised a different way of lifting the logs into place. He dragged over two long, straight tree limbs. Resting one end on the ground and the other on the log wall, they rolled the logs up this rough-looking ramp, and then Pa set them in their notches. Slowly the walls grew taller, higher than Daniel's head, higher than Pa's. They had to use forked poles cut from saplings to help move the highest logs into place. Until finally, a few days later, the walls were finished. Pa cut an opening in the front wall for a door and another on one end for a fireplace. You boys go down to the creek and look for stones, he ordered. Big ones, to build the fireplace wall. Back and forth to the creek went Daniel and Will, hauling the heavy stones. Meanwhile, Pa moved on to the roof. He had saved out one log, long and straight. This he stretched from one built-up end of the cabin to the other, and then he laid down sapling poles like ribs, forming a skeleton of a roof. With the ribs lashed in place, he began covering them with slabs of bark stripped from elm and basswood trees. I dare say it'll leak, he said, but it'll have to do for now. Maybe come spring we can put on a clapboard roof. When the boys had piled up all the large stones they could find, Pa sent them back to the creek to mix up the mud that would hold the fireplace together. Look for the clay along the banks, he told them. And as usual, it was Will whose sharp eyes spotted the streaks of white in the dark earth overhanging the creek. There, he said. Oh, and there's some more over there. Daniel felt a little prick of annoyance. Why was it Will seemed ahead of him all the time? He was the oldest. He ought to be the leader. He tried to make his voice sound like Pa's. We'll poke it out with sticks, he told Will. Daniel started digging out the clay. I see more on the other side, exclaimed Will. And before Daniel could answer, Will took a running start and leapt for the opposite bank. Looking up, Daniel saw him teetering on the edge over the dark running water, and for a second it looked like he was going to fall in, and then he grabbed a rock and pulled himself up. Did it! He scrambled up, clutching his ankle, though. Are you hurt? Daniel asked. Not much, Will grinned. Why'd you do that? You could have waded across. Well, I just wanted to see if I could do it. Well, that was Will. Not thinking about getting hurt, just wanting to see if he could do it. Well, Pa's waiting, Daniel reminded him. They poked out the clay and mixed it with water in the bucket until they had a thick mud, and then Daniel carried the bucket back to the cabin. Will was limping a little, he noticed. Stone by stone, Pa showed them how to build a three-sided fireplace around the opening that he'd left for it. Will lined up stones on the ground outside the cabin. Daniel covered the tops and the sides with the clay mixture, filling in all the cracks as smooth and even as he could. Will set on more stones and Daniel plastered them over. Now and then they had to stop to mix up more mud at the creek. Just like the log walls, the fireplace rose higher and higher until they ran out of stones. Well, what should we do? Daniel asked Pa. The fireplace was only as high as his chin, and it needed to go all the way to the roof. Pa stopped his work to look it over. Well, I reckon we'll leave it for now, he decided. Before winter comes, we can finish it off with a stick and clay chimney. Pa wasn't one not to complete a job that he'd started. He'd never let Daniel and Will quit any task that until they'd done every last bit just right. And for sure, he was in a hurry, Daniel thought. Well, they needed to finish the cabin before the days turned cool. And maybe, too, it was on account of Ma. Ever since this last baby came, she'd been feeling poorly, sitting down to rest after every chore. Most likely Pa was thinking about getting home to her. He worked all the next day to finish the roof, while Daniel and Will cleaned up inside the cabin. They piled leftover chips of wood next to the fireplace. Daniel turned over a fat end of a tree trunk to make a rough chair to sit on. Will found another like it, and they rolled it inside too. Finally, they hunted around in the brush for dry leaves. Combing out the twigs, they piled up the leaves along one wall for beds. It was late afternoon by the time they finished. Pa set down his axe next to the door. "Well," he said, looking around, "looks like we can move in." So they brought everything from the lean-to and arranged it near the fireplace. The meal sack and the salt bag and the other supplies. The iron pot and frying pan. Just one wooden spoon and no dishes. They hadn't had room in the saddlebags for anything more. Pa hung up a blanket over the doorway. "I'll bring some nails when I come back to make a proper door," he said. "We'll lay down a puncheon floor and build a sleeping loft up above, and no doubt your ma will want a window." Well, of course she would. Ma. For Ma, a house without a window or two wouldn't be civilized. And Pa would build a table, Daniel thought, and benches or a three-legged stool to sit on. Pa was handy with tools. Later on, for sure, there would be real bedsteads and shelves for Ma's dishes. Maybe even a cupboard in the corner. "Let's see how you boys did with the fireplace," Pa said. Would it draw? Daniel wondered. Had they built it high enough and sealed the stones tight enough? He and Will brought in some dry twigs and larger sticks of wood and laid them out in the fireplace opening. Pa struck a spark into a pile of leaves and bark, and they flamed up, spreading the fire to the wood. Smoke came billowing out, stinging Daniel's eyes. Pa frowned. Will began to cough, and smoke kept pouring out, filling the cabin with a gray haze. The fireplace wasn't going to work. And then one of the large sticks of wood caught on fire. The smoke started going up instead of out, and little by little the haze cleared. "Well, it looks like it's going to draw all right," said Pa. "You boys built that fireplace good and stout." Well, it was rare that Pa praised anything they did. Daniel looked over at Will. His brother always wore his feelings right on his face, and sure enough, Will's mouth split open into a wide smile. Daniel felt the same, though he kept it inside. He looked around the cabin in the flickering firelight. The log walls felt tight around them. The leafy beds had a fresh, clean smell. The bulging sack of meal in the corner promised that they wouldn't go hungry. And just for that moment, Daniel didn't see the cracks between the logs, or the unfinished door, and the roof that was sure to leak. Instead, he saw the cabin as it would be, with Ma bending over a bubbling stew at the fireplace, and Pa on a bench nearby oiling his musket, and he and Will showing Zeke how to whittle a whistle from a hollowed-out bit of wood, and the little girls setting the table for supper while the baby rocked peacefully in his cradle. The family together again, snug in their cabin. Soon, Daniel thought. And we'll stop right there. It's now the month of September. And we'll begin tomorrow with chapter 4. Have a good night, everyone. And don't forget, brush your teeth, wash your hands, and wash your face. Get into your pajamas. Give your parents a nice big hug, maybe a kiss. Tell your brothers and sisters you love them too. It's nice for them to hear it every once in a while. And have a good night, everybody.